Hello everyone, today we are here with
Maya, Beth,
Alexa.
and Riley, and we are going to be going over the Turkish-Armenian genocide.
we're going to start with the preconditions, causes, and historical precedents. Before the Turkish-Armenian genocide, Armenians were present in Anatolia, a Turkish region, long before the Turks. Armenians and other non-Muslims were discriminated against in the Ottoman Empire. In 1890, Armenians were forced to convert to Islam and had their land seized. In 1894 to 1897, state-sponsored Hamidian massacres killed 100,000 to 300,000 Armenians. In 1908, reformist group Young Turks took power and wanted to get rid of all non-Turks that were considered threats to the empire. The map on the right shows the concentration of Armenians during the time when they were deported, murdered, and driven out of Anatolia. As you can see, there were many preconditions prior to the genocide, including the earlier killings and government corruption that took place in the years before it officially began. Furthermore, in 1909, the Adana massacre killed around 17,000 Armenians. The authorities did not interfere with this, nor did they stop it. In 1913, the Committee of Union and Progress, otherwise known as the CUP, began committing genocide against Armenians once they rose in the government. At the same time, between 1912 and 1913, the Ottoman Empire lost 83% of European territorians during the Balkan Wars. This led to an increase in anti-Christian sentiment and strengthened nationalist desire to create ethnically homogeneous community. This also goes to show how wars and other conflicts can play a large role in genocides. We're now moving on to the stages of genocide, the first stage being classification. This is when the differences between people are not respected. There is a division of us and them, which can be carried out using stereotypes or excluding people who are perceived to be different. To begin, Armenians had their own language and church, and they were primarily Christian, while the rest of the Ottoman Empire was primarily Muslim. On April 24th in 1915, this was considered the start of the genocide because that was when the Turkish authorities arrested 250 Armenian intellectuals. This was because they feared the Armenians were working with Russia, which was the Ottoman Empire's historical rival. This made them consider Armenians as a threat. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary but quickly retreated after failures. They then tried to hide these failures from the public so that the Ottoman Empire's leaders openly blamed it on Armenians. They said that Armenians had betrayed the empire by fighting for enemy forces. This was similar to the Nazi stab-in-the-back myth. The map on the right also shows the large amount of Armenian churches that were present in Turkey before the genocide. Many of these were quickly destroyed after the genocide began, along with many schools. The next stage of the genocide was symbolization. Turkey did not use any specific symbols to classify the Armenians. However, in the Ottoman army, Armenian soldiers were seen as a threat to war effort and were massacred. The map on the left displays where massacres commonly occurred. This shows that Armenians were more often grouped by where they lived rather than a visual symbol. The next stage is discrimination. This is when a dominant group denies civil rights or even citizenship to identified groups. It was considered against the law for Armenians to carry weapons or ride horses. Their houses also could not overlook those of Muslims. Testimony from Armenians was also not admissible in courts of the law. Not only this, but those who were considered intellectually elite of the Armenian society were concentrated in areas such as Constantinople. They were then rounded up and killed. The remaining Armenians, who were mostly women, elderly, and children, were relocated from strategically important areas and forcibly marched to the Deir ez-Zor camp by Ottoman forces and other collaborators. They were provided little to no water on the death marches, and those who could not keep up were killed on the spot. Those who survived the marches were imprisoned in camps such as Deir ez-Zor and Ras Al-Ain. The conditions here were very poor, and many thousands of people died of disease and starvation.
The next stage of genocide is dehumanization. This is when those who are perceived as different are treated with no form of human rights or personal dignity. One example of this is in 1915, a telegram to a Turkish provincial official from Bahidin Shakir, a leader of the secret organization, created to plan and carry out the genocide. Shakir writes, "Are the Armenians who are being dispatched from there being liquidated? Are those harmful persons being exterminated, or are they merely being dispatched and exiled? Answer explicitly." Here we see him calling them harmful persons, one example of their personal dignity being taken away. The Armenians were also characterized as subhuman vermin who are sources of disease. On the right is a photo of a newspaper showing the hate that Armenians got publicly, and the propaganda that was spread about them with the title Christians Burnt Like Vermin. The next stage is organization, which is when regimes of hatred are training those to go on to carry out the destruction of a group of people. The government ordered certain villages and districts to be cleared of Armenians, but they didn't specify how. This ambiguity left the details to the armed militia, and because the details were so vague, it provided a means of denying blame after the fact when needed. This is because the government could say, oh, well, we didn't tell them to do it like that or to do that specific action, so they wouldn't have to take the blame. Another way to show that this genocide was planned was that the Armenians were relocated from strategically important areas. So they were going to areas that they knew were filled with Armenians and getting those out quickly and in the beginning. Another thing that was strategic was the series of consecutive laws passed that allowed government to confiscate Armenian properties and businesses and leave behind the deportees as wartime necessity. Other restrictions followed after, which left the Armenian population defenseless, and this was on purpose, showing that it was planned. The pictures on the right show the marches to the concentration camps and the conditions in the camps. Next, there is the stage of polarization, which is when propaganda begins to be spread by hate groups. One way the government did this was by instilling fear into the large, moderate Turk population, especially those who would otherwise oppose their friends and neighbors being targeted. So they kind of went for the people that didn't have strong opinions on what was happening to try to convince them to side with them. Also, like we showed before in the dehumanization slide, there was the article that had the title Christians Burnt Like Vermin, and that's another example of how propaganda was spread, and that was like through the media at the time, like papers. I think the biggest form of propaganda that is present is that the government attributed all their war failures to the Armenian treachery and claiming that the Armenians were traitors, because that is one lie that like many people in the population believed. It's also a statement that would rile the people up, which would make them believe it even more. This again brings up the stabbed in the back theory idea, because the CUP claimed the Armenians had stabbed the Turks in the back. The next stage is preparation. This is when the perpetrators plan the genocide. It's kind of similar to the organization stage, but they often use euphemisms. They also create fear of the victim and build up their armies and weapons. In terms of the euphemisms that were used, the deportations were often disguised as resettlement programs. We see clear proof of preparation because on January 12, 1915, evidence was released that reads Ahmed Muammar, the Governor General of Sivas Province, orders the destruction of Tavrakoy and other strategically located villages around the city of Sivas to make future defense impossible for Armenians inside the city of Sivas. Strategically located buildings were requisitioned. Like stated before, the areas they chose for the deportations and destruction were strategic and planned. And again, they're stripping the Armenians of any type of defense. Ottoman officials also justified the deportations as a precautionary measure that was essential to the defense of the empire. They often used the ongoing wars or conflicts as a way to justify the genocide and rally support. And this shows that destruction of the Armenians was closely linked to the events of World War I in the Near East and the Russian Caucasus. Then there's the stage of persecution, where victims are identified because of their ethnicity or religion and death lists are drawn up. This is when the genocidal massacres really begin. This is often when people are sometimes segregated into ghettos, they're deported, they're starved, and their property can be taken. When the Armenians are deported to the camps, there's a spread of starvation, dehydration, illness, and disease among them, and there are also beatings and forced marches. When it comes to the genocidal massacres between March and October 1916, there was another wave of executions, and as many as 200,000 or more people were murdered. The next stage is extermination, when the hate group murders their identified victims in a deliberate and systematic campaign of violence. This stage is very present in this genocide, as at least 664,000 and possibly as many as 1.2 million Armenians were killed, and they died in both massacres and individual killings. They also died through systematic ill treatment, exposure, and starvation. which reveals the deliberate aspect of this stage. The pictures below show just a little bit of the many atrocities that occurred during this genocide. You can see all of the dead bodies and the kids and the adults who look very emaciated and are starving and struggling to stay alive.
The next stage of genocide is denial. The article that is linked is proof of denial by the Turkish government. It is the Republic of Turkey's Ministry of Foreign Affairs displaying false information saying that the genocide did not occur. One fact that they wrote was, quote, "Fact 4. The Armenian deaths do not constitute genocide. The Armenians took arms against their own government. Their violent political aims, not their race, ethnicity, or religion, rendered them subject to relocation," end quote. Along with Turkey, 2 other countries strongly believe that the genocide did not occur, those being Azerbaijan and Pakistan. As you can see of the photo on the right, it is present-day protesters fighting against the Turkish government for still not believing that the Armenian genocide occurred. So when and where did this happen? The genocide predominantly occurred during the spring of 1915 to the fall of 1916. It officially began on April 24, 1915. The area that had the most killings of Armenian refugees during the genocide was a concentration camp called Deir ez-Zor, and it was considered the final destination for these prisoners. However, these acts of discrimination didn't just occur there. They occurred all over the Ottoman Empire. The map on the left shows the different deportation centers. The red dots show the many deportation control centers. The pink dots show deportation stations. The black dots show concentration and annihilation centers. The arrows show the routes to the deportation centers. As you can see, there were an immense amount of deportation and concentration camps throughout Turkey. The map on the right shows the Armenian population before 1915 and the population today. As you can see, it majorly decreased. Before 1915, there were around 1 to 1.5 million Armenian people in the Ottoman Empire. However, now there are only 70,000 Armenians. So who were the main perpetrators, victims, and primary players of this genocide? The Muslim Turks and the Ottoman government are the main perpetrators of the genocide. The victims were the Christian Armenian minority, with 1.2 million of them being murdered throughout 1915 to 1916. The CUP, or the Committee of Union and Progress, and the Young Turks, who were a group of young male revolutionaries against the Ottoman Empire, were some of the more primary players throughout all of this. They spread this idea of discrimination and genocide of the Armenians. In one of the first systematic killings of genocide, the Armenian troops were shot after losing the Battle of Sarkamis by the Ottoman troops. The Ottoman troops were the main individuals who were responsible for killing throughout this genocide. Going back to the first systematic killings, instead of blaming the Young Turk government, they manipulated it to blaming it on the Armenians. Did the government get involved, or was this pre-planned or spontaneous? During this time, citizens of the Ottoman Empire that were not Armenian would watch all of this occur and not say anything about it. They even agreed with the organized mass killings that occurred in the Armenian villages. The government was campaigning to deport and mass kill the Armenians that lived in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman government system had been preparing the society for the discrimination and killings against the Armenians, because of the alienation that is present in their unequal government laws and acts. The actions were definitely not spontaneous. The whole Ottoman society agreed with the discrimination and killings against the Armenians. The end of the genocide occurred in 1923. With this came the rise of persecutions which varied in intensity. By that time, the Ottoman Empire was no longer in existence and was replaced with the Republic of Turkey. The United States mostly supplied aid groups to relieve the Armenian survivors. Relief groups raised more than $100 million to help with more than 2 million Armenian refugees. Along with that, thousands of Armenian people were adopted by Westerners if they did not have a family to go home to. In 1918, after the Ottomans surrendered, the Young Turk leaders fled to Germany since Germany promised they would not prosecute them for genocide. However, some Armenian nationalists organized a plan called Operation Nemesis, which essentially was to track down and assassinate the leaders of the genocide.
The reactions of world powers and the UN to the genocide have evolved over time due to changing political dynamics and growing awareness of human rights. The United States was well informed about the genocide, but their initial reaction was to not do anything because of their isolation policies during World War I. In 1915, the Allied powers, France, Britain, and Russia, issued a joint declaration stating that the Turkish had committed crimes against humanity and civilization. As allies of the Ottoman Empire and with knowledge of the genocide, Germany and Austria-Hungary had mixed responses because some diplomats and military officers expressed their horror with the genocide, but their governments downplayed the events in order to maintain their alliance. After World War I, the League of Nations provided support to the Armenian refugees, but they did not take steps to hold the perpetrators accountable. In 1919, Young Turk conspirators were prosecuted by the Ottoman government after the war for their crimes of massacre and plunder. In 1920, the Treaty of Sevres was created, which included the prosecution of Ottoman officials responsible for the wartime crimes. The international community, however, did not question the massacre of the Armenians. Although the perpetrators were prosecuted, the Armenians still yearned for recognition of the genocide. Different nations and the UN recognized the genocide, such as in 1975, the United States Congress introduced the Commemorative Resolutions, which is a significant step towards recognizing the Armenian genocide. In 1985, the UN Commission on Human Rights made a significant move to document and recognize the atrocities of the Armenian genocide by adopting a report on genocide. On June 18, 1987, the European Parliament adopted a resolution which marked an important moment in the international acknowledgement of the genocide. Legislatures acquired resolutions that declared the Armenian genocide on the historical record and made announcements and declarations that were made by heads of states that similarly acknowledged what had happened. Similarly, presidents of the United States issued statements and many members of Congress distributed official condolences to the Armenians on their day of mourning. However, in recent times, U.S. presidents have avoided the phrase genocide because of pressure from the Turkish government. Post-genocide, the Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day is held every year on April 24th in order to honor the victims, and this day is officially observed by Armenia, France, Argentina, Canada, and also the state of California. In 2021, the U.S. president fulfilled a campaign pledge and also recognized the genocide, which is a big step in the international recognition of the genocide. Many memorials have been built for the Armenian genocide and the victims who were killed in it. The most famous one is located in Yerevan, Armenia. Although there is now international recognition of the Armenian genocide, the Turks still claim that the Armenians were resettled for military purposes and even denied that they were ever exterminated. They also destroyed documents that seem to be incriminating, and they are still in denial of the genocide's reality. Turkey also claims that their death count is exaggerated and say that the deaths were caused by other things like civil war, disease, bad weather, rogue local officials, or bands of Kurds and outlaws. The denial of the Armenian genocide is also taught in schools, and those who recognize the genocide have been prosecuted. In 2015, a study was done and showed that only 9% of Turkish citizens recognize the genocide, showing that this is what's being taught in Turkey. Resistance to the deportations was infrequent. Only once the entire population of an Armenian settlement managed to avoid death. The mountaineers of Musa Dagh defended themselves in the heights above their villages until French naval vessels in the eastern Mediterranean detected them and got them to safety. The inhabitants of the city of Van in eastern Armenia defended themselves until they were relieved by Russian forces. They abandoned the city in May 1915, a month after the siege was lifted and when the Russian army withdrew. The population was hunted down by Turkish irregular forces. Artillery destroyed inland cities that refused to surrender, such as Urfa.
Milyon cesaret. Kayışmi emas atkan samastalyan karış. Տասնհինգ թվին թուրքը մեր վրա հարձակվել է, ուզում է մեզ չարթի վերացնի։ Դավա շալոնը շարեցին աքսոր։
Türkler mezgahane içinde.
Իմ հերը բռնացերիցս, ես եմ մի փոքր երեխա։ Թուրքերը մեզի տպում են, հարացանի ու բանով, ով չի գարում կելի անխիժորեն։ Վալայի կչեն վարետակ, չլուրեն։
Ոչ հերունին, ոչ մերունին, ոչ աղբերին, լրիվ, գնացերը։ Չկե։
Անորթության պես դիշման, աղջին եջան անորթութեն է։ Կասիտ ծրավ, կծավ չիթու պենի թուշն ու կնաս։
Թաք, ես սովորեցի կտակ։